Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Texas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1874, and most of West Texas still lay in uneasy silence between rail towns and the borderlands. That summer, two sisters, Clara and May Lafferty, rode into the county seat of Sierra Verde. They came with no entourage, only two chestnut horses, a weathered wagon, and the kind of confidence that made men at the saloon door set down their glasses. Few in town knew where they'd come from, though some whispered of a burned homestead near Fort Stockton, where a family had vanished after a debt dispute. The sisters spoke little, but when they did, their accents betrayed old Texas roots, not the kind that came by way of stagecoach newcomers. Old court records from the Hudspeth County archives describe the Laffertys as enterprising women of rough reputation, skilled in livestock trade, and unacquainted with the modesty expected of their sex. They leased a small parcel near the Salt Flats, close to where the San Elizario Salt War would later unfold, a conflict that would tear through families and force the army to intervene. That frontier tension hung thick in the air even then, ranchers against prospectors, lawmen bought by mine owners, and settlers vanishing without record. By autumn, locals began noticing their absence. Ranch hands, travelers, men who'd crossed the sisters' path over cards or cattle disputes. Most rode out into the desert and never came back. The sheriff, a man named Ezra Tully, logged their names in neat ink. Disappeared west of Verde Creek, presumed lost to coyotes or Apaches. But the pattern soon drew notice. Each disappearance came within days of a sighting of the Lafferty wagon. Witnesses recalled seeing it parked under the mesquite near the salt trail, its tarp drawn and lantern dimmed, long past midnight. One storekeeper, Lewis Rains, claimed he once saw the older sister unloading heavy sacks from the wagon bed into a dry arroyo. He said she worked fast, looking over her shoulder, her hands red to the wrists. When he told the sheriff, Tully just shook his head. "Those women keep to themselves," he said. "Ain't no law against hard work." Still, the rumors thickened like the desert heat. The San Elizario affair, mentioned in a local gazette that year, spoke of rising tempers, of women and men arming themselves to defend what they called God-given salt. To some, Clara and May Lafferty fit right into that violent new order, where justice was personal and mercy scarce. As night fell on Sierra Verde, lanterns burned low in the windows, and people began locking their doors a little earlier. Out past the flats, coyotes howled. Some swore the sisters rode out with them. By the spring of 1875, the Lafferty sisters had settled into a routine that made them nearly invisible by day and unforgettable by night. Their small holding by the salt flats grew into a way station of sorts, part corral, part trading post. Travelers heading toward El Paso or back east through Pecos often stopped there for water, supplies, or just a glimpse of the infamous pair who lived without men, church, or apologies. They were polite enough, locals said, but something about them carried the stillness of desert thunder. County ledger entries show that Clara handled most of the transactions. She signed with a precise hand, uncommon among women of the plains and always in black ink. May, the younger by 3 years, was quieter. She tended to the horses, repaired tack, and often disappeared for hours along the dry creek bed. Old maps place their property within 30 miles of the San Elizario Basin, where the first disputes over salt rights were stirring, arguments that would soon turn to bloodshed. Frontier reports from the El Paso Sentinel describe that same region as a land governed by its own rules and its own ghosts. One night in late May, a rancher named Thomas Kearney failed to return from a cattle drive. His last stop, according to a drifter's statement, had been the Lafferty place. He'd ridden there with a wounded hand, seeking rest and water. When his horse wandered back to town 3 days later, Sheriff Tully rode out with 2 deputies. They found no sign of Kearney. The sisters claimed he'd left before dawn, headed south toward the Pecos Trail. They even showed his canteen, left behind by mistake, as Clara put it. Tully wrote the incident off as another case of desert misfortune, though in later testimony his deputy admitted the air there felt wrong, too still, too sweet, like death was waiting to be noticed. Rumors spread faster than dust storms. A boy gathering mesquite near their fence claimed he saw May digging at night, her skirts tied up and her face streaked with dirt. Others said coyotes gathered near their land, but never howled, as if something stronger had already marked the territory. It wasn't long before the sisters became less neighbors and more legend. The papers called them the Horsewomen of Verde Creek, a name that stuck even as the salt disputes erupted into open warfare a few years later. The San Elizario Salt War, noted again in contemporary letters, cast a long shadow. Families fled, soldiers arrived, and records vanished in courthouse fires. Among those missing were the Lafferty sisters. No graves, no warrants, no remains. Only a single ledger page survived in the county book, signed by Clara Lafferty on July 2, 1877. The same month, the Salt rioters took up arms. After that, the ink stopped cold. But locals say 2 horses were found tethered miles from the flats, their reins cut and their saddles torn, as though someone had fled in a hurry and never looked back. By late 1877, the desert around Sierra Verde had emptied of travelers. The Salt War further south had turned neighbor against neighbor, and the fear of ambush made every rider glance twice at the horizon. But for those few who still passed near the Lafferty claim, stories began to emerge that blurred the line between witness and warning. A freight driver named Joel Ingram later swore in a written affidavit that he'd seen 2 women on horseback trailing his wagon near dusk. He described their clothing as plain, dust-covered, but their faces were pale as chalk under the brim. They never spoke. When he reached town, he realized his rear wheel was missing 2 bolts, the same kind that might loosen if a hand had worked at them quietly during a stop. The constable dismissed it as imagination, but Ingram's account joined a growing pile of similar reports: missing livestock, half-dug graves, riders heard but not seen. In that same season, the name Lafferty appeared again in a county court docket, though the entry was later struck through with a thick black line. A notation beside it read simply, "Witness deemed unreliable." This obscure entry, found decades later by a historian studying the San Elizario Salt War, became one of the few traces connecting the sisters to that violent chapter of Texas history. It's believed they may have traded salt for gunpowder and horses, moving quietly among factions on both sides. No record ever confirmed their allegiance, only that they seemed to survive while others vanished. One diary, kept by Reverend Alton Briggs of Sierra Verde, mentions them briefly. 2 women came by the mission this evening, asking if the Lord keeps count of those who fall nameless in the desert. I told them he does. They smiled. It was not a kind smile. By the early months of 1878, the fires of the Salt War had dimmed, but the echoes remained across the desert. Ranchers spoke in half-whispers of empty corrals, vanished hands and tracks that led nowhere. The Lafferty sisters, though unseen for nearly a year, still lived in the mouths of townsfolk, like an open wound that refused to close. Every stranger who rode through Sierra Verde seemed to stir the old fear again. "Could be one of theirs," a storekeeper muttered once, glancing at a veiled woman crossing the square. A military patrol from Fort Davis was dispatched that spring to survey the burned homestead. Their commander, Captain Horace Willard, recorded in his field journal that the soil was uneven and spongy, the scent of decay too recent for mere animals. When his men began digging near the charred remains of a corral, they uncovered the first of what would later be called the Verde Creek graves. 3 shallow pits, each marked by a half-buried horseshoe. No markers, no names, just remnants of fabric and the rusted buckle of a man's belt. The discovery briefly reignited local panic. Families locked their wells, moved their stock and posted armed guards near town. Old newspapers, most lost to time, refer to the case in short, cautious paragraphs. One clipping from the El Paso Sentinel reads, "Bodies of 3 unidentified men found near former Lafferty property. Authorities uncertain whether victims of robbery or feud. Investigation ongoing." That investigation never reached a conclusion. The constable who took charge, Benjamin Oates, vanished within 2 weeks of visiting the site. His horse was later found tethered to a mesquite stump, reins cut. No blood, no struggle. Only his badge, half buried in sand. Midway through that same year, the Salt War historian who had earlier examined the Lafferty court record made note of Oates's disappearance in a private letter, observing that this country breeds a silence deeper than any grave. He was referring to the same strange pattern the way names tied to the sisters seemed to fade from the ledger of the living. That line, paraphrased from the old San Elizario Salt War research, remains one of the few written reflections connecting them to that violent frontier. By the end of 1878, the county sheriff declared the case dormant. The desert reclaimed what it wanted. Grass grew over the pits, wind polished the stones smooth, and the Lafferty legend became a ghostly shorthand for vengeance. Children dared each other to ride past the flats at night, and some claimed they heard hooves on hardpan, slow, measured, unhurried. Old folks said it wasn't coyotes that howled out there anymore. It was the echo of women who never needed a judge, only the dark. By 1879, the frontier had changed hands more times than anyone could count. Rail lines pushed closer, telegraph wires hummed faintly across the desert, yet Sierra Verde remained stubbornly isolated. Its people clung to their stories, and none clung tighter than the tale of the two women who rode by night and left no witnesses. A traveling journalist named Edwin Morrow arrived that summer, hoping to document the lingering aftermath of the Salt War. His letters, later recovered by his editor in Galveston, mentioned the Lafferty sisters by name. He described the locals' unease, how they still kept lanterns burning through the night, and how one prospector swore he'd seen two riders crossing the flats beneath a half-moon, neither casting a shadow. Morrow treated it as folklore, but his writing hinted at something heavier, fear disguised as tradition. In one of his field notes, Morrow referenced the San Elizario Salt War as the curtain through which the darker play of frontier justice revealed itself. He suspected the sisters were either participants or opportunists, using the chaos to settle debts and disappear. His last letter from Sierra Verde ended abruptly. Met an old woman who claims to have known the younger one. May, she called her. Says the girl never slept through the night, always waiting for the sound of spurs outside her door. I asked where she was now. The woman said, still waiting. Morrow was found dead a week later, miles north of the old Verde Creek Trail. His horse had returned to town without him, saddle intact, journal missing. Only his pocket watch remained. Its hands stopped at 12:03. The coroner's report called it exposure. Locals disagreed. They said the desert keeps what belongs to it, and by now the Laffertys were part of its claim. Meanwhile, small discoveries continued to surface. Air traveler digging for water near the salt basin found a ring engraved with the initials CL. A faded entry in the county's artifact log described it as silver, warped by heat, recovered from site associated with outlaw habitation. The entry was never filed under any case number. Sheriff Tully, now retired and frail, refused to comment when questioned by a reporter decades later. He simply said, "Some things you bury twice, once for the body and once for the telling." In the years that followed, the Lafferty legend merged with the geography itself. Maps marked the region as abandoned homestead or salt trail crossing, but the locals still called it the Sisters' Run. Ranch hands avoided camping there, claiming the ground stayed warm even after sundown. And though the San Elizario Salt War had long passed into textbooks, its shadow lingered in those sands where law, vengeance, and silence all spoke the same language. By 1880, Sierra Verde had begun to recover from the lean years, but recovery didn't mean peace. The scars of the Salt War still ran through the land, old grudges, broken alliances, and graves that had never been properly marked. For some, the Lafferty sisters were little more than a fireside tale to keep children in line. For others, they were a warning that justice in Texas didn't always wear a badge. That year, a deputy named Jonah Reeves reopened a portion of the old Verde Creek file. He'd found mention of the sisters' names in an unsigned affidavit buried among the Salt War testimonies, statements collected from settlers who'd fled during the uprising. One paragraph described two women in men's coats, seen trading horses with the insurgent party east of San Elizario. Another claimed they delivered salt blocks wrapped in gunpowder, disguised as trade goods. Reeves was convinced the sisters had used the conflict as cover for something darker, perhaps revenge, perhaps profit. His investigation led him to the ruins of the Lafferty homestead. He wrote in his journal, "The ground still burns underfoot when the sun hits it. No birds here, no sound but the wind." He camped overnight by the dry creek and noted what he called low hoofbeats, too steady for ghosts, too quiet for cattle. At dawn, he followed the sound and found a set of tracks, two horses side by side heading toward the basin. The prints vanished after 30 yards, swallowed by loose sand. Reeves's journal ends there. He was never seen again. Only his hat was recovered, wedged beneath a mesquite thorn, brim torn as if by fingernails. When word of his disappearance reached Fort Davis, Captain Willard, now retired, remarked bitterly to a reporter, "You can't hunt the dead, son. They hunt you." It was one of his final public statements before his passing. Some historians later suggested that the entire Verde Creek affair had been exaggerated, fueled by the hysteria following the San Elizario Salt War. Yet the pattern of vanishings, men tied to the investigation, travelers who crossed. By the spring of 1882, most of Texas had moved on. Railroads, telegraph lines, new settlers, and new lawmen. But Sierra Verde remained what it had always been, a shadowed outpost caught between maps and memory. Few travelers stopped there anymore, and those who did left with stories instead of supplies. It was during this time that Dr. Eli Cartwright, a physician from Austin, came west in search of mineral springs rumored to have healing properties. He spent 3 months surveying water sources near the old salt basin and kept detailed notes of his findings. In one entry dated April 17th, he wrote, "Heard mention again of the women who rode through these parts. Lafferty or Lafferty, the spelling uncertain. The locals treat their story not as superstition, but as unfinished business." Cartwright's notes reveal that he was familiar with the San Elizario Salt War accounts, particularly the reports of displaced families and burned settlements. He used them as context to understand the strange emptiness of this region, a land where law had come and gone like passing weather. He wrote of seeing abandoned wells filled not with water, but with sand and ash, as though the desert had deliberately buried its own history. One evening near Verde Creek, he encountered an old herdsman named Nathan Price, who claimed to have once traded with the sisters. Price described May as quiet, sad-eyed, but steady as iron, while Clara was the talker, the planner, the one who smiled when danger came near. He recalled selling them a rifle and a set of bridles in 1875, just before the disappearances began. When Cartwright asked if he believed the stories of murder, Price only said, "The coyotes here don't eat everything. Some things they leave alone." Weeks later, Cartwright's assistant fell ill and died under unclear circumstances. The physician buried him near the creek, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. In his final letter before returning east, Cartwright noted an unsettling discovery. A woman's spur half buried near the gravesite, its rowel rusted but still sharp. He packed it with his instruments, but the item was never found among his belongings after his death. His surviving notes, later studied by historians comparing frontier accounts to the San Elizario Salt War timeline, became one of the last formal mentions of the Lafferty sisters in any official record. By then, the county's archives had already suffered multiple fires, one in 1884, another in 1887, wiping out much of what little remained of that era's documentation. The sisters' legend survived only in letters, rumors, and the kind of quiet fear that refuses to die. At sunset, the land around Sierra Verde looked almost peaceful. But travelers said that if you lingered too long, the wind carried something else, a faint rhythm like the sound of 2 riders keeping perfect pace, heading nowhere anyone living could follow. By 1883, Sierra Verde had dwindled to a collection of stone foundations and half-remembered names. A single general store remained, operated by a widow named Mrs. Nellie Brand, who claimed to have once seen the sisters riding along the ridge at dusk. Her statement, recorded in a 1901 interview, describes the moment in unnervingly calm detail. They rode as if the wind itself held the reins. No dust behind them, no hoofprints left after. I knew then the land had chosen to keep them. Around this time, local law enforcement received reports of grave tampering near the old Verde Creek site. A patrol sent to investigate found 2 of the Verde Creek graves disturbed, one empty, one partially collapsed. The remaining bones appeared clean, as though washed and replaced deliberately. No evidence of robbery, no animal tracks, just the quiet precision of human hands. Sheriff's Deputy Alan Rourke wrote in his report, "This place carries no echo. When you speak, the sound dies before it leaves your lips." Rourke later resigned, citing unsettled nerves and indigestion brought on by the climate, though his resignation letter contained a single line underlined twice: "They still ride." During that same year, a traveling preacher from Marfa passed through Sierra Verde and gave an impromptu sermon on sin and vengeance. He claimed that the devil does not come from below but rides beside us until the dust takes him. Locals swore that as he spoke, a wind rose suddenly, scattering hymn sheets into the canyon. When the preacher left the following morning, he refused to ride west, choosing instead to circle 50 miles north to avoid the salt flats entirely. Historians later cross-referenced these accounts with the San Elizario Salt War records, noting that many figures involved in the conflict, soldiers, ranchers, and traders, simply disappeared after 1878. No records of their burials exist, though many had been known to frequent the routes surrounding Sierra Verde. Some theorized the sisters used the chaos of that era to erase their trail, while others believed they became something beyond history, absorbed into the folklore that the war itself had birthed. By 1885, the last surviving witness who claimed first-hand knowledge of the sisters, Nathan Price, died quietly in his sleep. In his will, he left a single note among his personal papers: "Tell them not to dig. The desert covers mercy as well as guilt." No one ever learned what he meant. Years later, when travelers tried to find the ruins, the landmarks had shifted. The creek had rerouted after heavy rain, and the basin's edges were swallowed by dunes. Only a lone cottonwood remained, half dead but standing. Those who passed beneath it said they felt a vibration in the ground, as if something long buried was listening, waiting for its name to be spoken once more. By 1886, the name Sierra Verde had all but faded from official maps. A few surveyors still marked the area as a salt district, but most maps labeled it uninhabited. That same year, an aging newspaperman named Silas Crane passed through while collecting stories for a book he planned to title The Unrecorded Frontier. In one of his draft chapters found posthumously, he wrote about the two ghost riders of the Pecos Trail, women who fed their enemies to the sand and never looked back. Crane interviewed anyone who'd talk, though the residents were reluctant. He managed to find Mrs. Brand, the storekeeper, who repeated her old warning: they never died. Mr. Crane, the desert wouldn't take them. She told him of strange noises on still nights, like boots scraping rock, or a woman's laughter carried low across the wind. Crane's writing suggested skepticism, but his tone changed after visiting the flats himself. He described the landscape as hushed, as if the earth itself were keeping watch, and noted faint impressions resembling hoof prints that led in circles and ended at the creek bed. Curiously, Crane's notebook referenced the San Elizario Salt War twice. He speculated that the Lafferty sisters might have been informants for one of the militias, smuggling goods or intercepting travelers loyal to the opposition. Yet even he admitted that the timeline didn't fit perfectly. Too many deaths, too few explanations. Something else worked here, he wrote, something that followed no flag and feared no law. Crane disappeared not long after sending his notes east. His horse and satchel were found near the cottonwood tree by Verde Creek. By 1888, Sierra Verde was little more than a dot on faded survey maps, a ghost settlement visited only by passing traders or cattle drovers. But in that same year, a new railroad survey crew stopped near the salt basin to take measurements for a proposed spur line. Among them was a draftsman named Henry Lowe, who kept a meticulous field diary now preserved in the archives at Fort Davis. His first entry was ordinary: temperatures, coordinates, soil readings. Then on the third night the tone changed. We heard riders, 2, perhaps 3. No campfires, no lamps, only hooves in sand drawing close, then stopping all at once. The next morning Lowe reported that one of the crew's mules was missing, along with a bundle of survey stakes. No tracks led away from camp, though the men swore they'd heard movement around the wagons just before dawn. Lowe wrote that the men refused to continue the route and insisted on circling east toward Pecos, adding 2 weeks to their schedule. He recorded their unease without ridicule. They spoke the name Lafferty as though it meant more than death. I've never seen grown men so spooked by a pair of ghosts they claim not to believe in. Later that year, Lowe met a veteran of the San Elizario Salt War who was now employed as a guide for prospectors. The man, identified only as R. Wibara in the diary, claimed he'd once dealt salt with the sisters before the uprising turned violent. He said they could shoot straighter than most men, and that one of them, Clara, had a habit of carving small notches into her rifle stock after every settled debt. Ibarra described their faces as sunburned and tired, but clear of fear. He ended his account with a strange remark. They weren't demons. They just stopped believing daylight meant safety. When Lowe returned east the following year, his reports were dismissed by the railroad company as folklore interference. The proposed spur line was abandoned, but copies of his diary circulated quietly among researchers studying Texas frontier legends. One passage, likely referring to the old Lafferty claim, read, "There is a wind that walks there, and it keeps the pace of a horse." As the 1890s dawned, the sisters' story drifted even further into the realm of legend, though it never entirely disappeared. Children in nearby towns recited rhymes about them, warning travelers not to camp where the salt turns pink at dusk. And among the few who still rode the basin at night, there remained a ritual. When the wind picked up suddenly, riders would touch their hats and whisper, "Ride on, ladies." For most, it was just tradition. For others, it was insurance, because sometimes, if you listened closely, you could still hear the slow rhythm of two horses keeping pace in the dark, steady, patient, never far behind. By 1891, the last formal record of the Lafferty case was entered into the Hudspeth County files, a transfer of the sisters' old property title to unknown heirs. It was a clerical effort more than an act of justice, meant to close the book on a story that refused to stay buried. The land itself, though legally reassigned, remained untouched. Locals called it dead acreage, saying no crops grew there, no wells stayed sweet. That same year, a photographer named Elias Wren passed through Sierra Verde while documenting the abandoned settlements of West Texas. His surviving plates show empty horizons and collapsed homesteads, except one. A blurred figure appears at the edge of a shot near the salt flats, a woman on horseback, hair loose, face turned from the camera. Wren's notes beneath the image read, "Exposure error, no one present when taken." Experts later concluded it was likely a trick of light, though others weren't so sure. Wren had also kept a small pocket diary, found among his effects after his death in 1894. In one entry, he described a visit to the ruined Lafferty homestead, guided by an aging scout who refused to cross the creek. "He said the ground still remembers," Wren wrote. "He told me to take no stones, no dirt, not even a photograph, lest I invite their attention." That same entry mentioned the San Elizario Salt War, framing it as the beginning of Texas's long argument with its own ghosts. He drew parallels between the conflict's lawless energy and the Lafferty's fate, how violence and silence had become the region's unspoken inheritance. Wren seemed fascinated by how the desert erased men, but preserved fear, as if it had its own kind of memory. A month after taking the photographs, Wren's assistant disappeared. His horse was found half a mile from the creek, saddle torn, camera shattered beside it. Wren abandoned the project and returned east, though his letters reveal he never slept soundly again. He wrote to a colleague, "If there are women still riding out there, they are not alive as we understand it. The desert keeps what it needs, and it has need of them." After Wren's death, his glass negatives were sold with the rest of his estate. Most were broken in transit, but the one with the blurred rider survived. It now sits in a private collection, mislabeled simply as Pecos Region 1891. By then, Sierra Verde was gone entirely. Its last residents moved east, its post office shuttered. Only the basin remained, shimmering in the heat, unclaimed and unkind. And on certain evenings, as the wind turned warm and low, travelers reported hearing what sounded like two horses passing just beyond sight, their pace steady, their purpose unknowable, as though still keeping a promise made long ago. By 1893, the frontier had been declared closed by officials in Washington, but no one in Texas truly believed it. Frontiers don't close, they fade, and what lingers behind them often defies the neat lines drawn on maps. The story of the Lafferty sisters was one of those remnants, half myth, half memory, still alive in the dust. That summer, a small team of geologists from Austin arrived to catalog mineral deposits along the Verde Creek Basin. Their leader, Professor Adrian Holt, was known for his skepticism toward superstition. He wrote in his field log, "The men whisper of women who haunt these parts, calling them riders of vengeance. I remind them that this region's only ghosts are the shadows of the San Elizario Salt War, the greed of men, not spirits of women. Holt's confidence didn't last. After a week of surveying, one of his assistants vanished during a night watch. The next morning they found his lantern still burning beside an untouched cup of coffee. Tracks surrounded the camp, 2 horses side by side, but no sign of approach or retreat. The ground was smooth, like wind had passed over it, and pressed the sand flat again. In his next entry, Holt's tone changed. "I can no longer dismiss the stories. Something moves here that obeys no season or logic. When we sleep, the wind circles the tents like a living thing." They left the basin 2 days later. Holt's report was never published, though a summary survives in the university archives. It concludes with a curious line: "This land remembers too clearly. Every step is an echo." That same year, a drought struck the region. Ranchers searching for new wells unearthed fragments of charred timber and a rusted horseshoe at the old. By 1895, few who lived near the old Sierra Verde Basin could recall the sisters clearly. Yet everyone knew the story. The Laffertys had become part of the landscape, spoken of in the same breath as mirages, quicksand, and rattlesnakes. Parents warned their children not to wander far from camp, not because of bandits or wolves, but because the riders might find you first. That year, a pair of fortune seekers from Abilene, Sam Rooker and Eli Morse, arrived chasing rumors of a buried cache near the salt flats. They had heard of a lost chest taken from a militia payroll during the chaos of the San Elizario Salt War nearly 20 years earlier. The story claimed the gold was hidden by 2 women who vanished before anyone could recover it. The men laughed at the superstition, confident they'd be rich by week's end. Their campsite was found 3 days later, tents flattened, belongings scattered, fire still smoldering. Both men were gone. Their horses, oddly, were tethered and calm. In the sand beside the camp, someone or something had drawn 2 perfect circles with a riding crop. The sheriff's deputy who investigated said he'd never seen such deliberate marks. "They were made to be seen," he wrote in his report, "not to be understood." The missing men were never recovered, but the discovery renewed local fear. No one ventured near Verde Creek for years afterward. A preacher passing through tried to calm the townsfolk, reminding them that evil with no witness is only rumor, but his wagon overturned near the basin that same week. He survived, though he refused to speak of what he'd seen, telling only the doctor who treated him, "They're still riding." Reverend Briggs was right. That cryptic remark linked him unintentionally to earlier records mentioning Reverend Alton Briggs, whose own encounter with the sisters had been logged 2 decades before. The parallel was eerie. Both men of the cloth, both shaken beyond reason, both leaving behind near-identical testimonies. It was as if time had folded in on itself, the same event repeating under different skies. Newspapers printed brief blurbs about the ghost riders of Sierra Verde, turning the story into a curiosity for city readers. But to those living nearby, it was never amusement. Night riders still claimed to hear hoofbeats, especially near the old cottonwood. And one family, the Calderons, abandoned their home after finding their well filled with clean sand overnight. No footprints leading to or from it. As the century drew to a close, the desert reclaimed even the memory of settlement. Wind erased wagon ruts, storms flattened fences. But what it could not bury was the rhythm that locals swore still echoed across the flats. 2 sets of hooves, keeping time in a silence older than law, older than forgiveness. Some said they were vengeance, others justice. But most agreed on one thing: no one ever truly leaves Sierra Verde. By 1897, the legend of the Lafferty sisters had grown beyond the borders of Texas. Penny dreadfuls sold in St. Louis, and Chicago printed embellished versions of the story under lurid titles like The Vengeance Riders of the Salt. Flats? Most readers assumed it was fiction, a ghost tale spun from the dying embers of the frontier. But for those who lived within a day's ride of Sierra Verde, the story still carried weight. Every so often, someone would vanish without a trace, and the townsfolk would simply say, "The desert called them home." That same year, a former deputy from Fort Davis, James Calder, was hired to escort a survey team through the basin. Calder had once served under Sheriff Tully, the man who first recorded the Lafferty case more than 20 years earlier. In his journal, Calder admitted he had never believed the stories, but that skepticism began to falter on their 3rd night in camp. He wrote, "I heard horses again, 2 pacing slow along the ridge. We called out, no answer. The men swore they saw shadows move against the starlight, but there was no moon to cast them. The next morning the team found hoofprints around the camp, large, clear and recent. Each pair ended in the same peculiar pattern, a turn inward, as though the riders faced each other before vanishing. One man refused to continue, Calder noted. He said he'd seen enough of what law can't fix. That night Calder dreamed of two women standing by a well. Their faces were hidden by dust, their voices carried like wind through dry grass. When he woke, his water barrel was overturned, though no one else stirred. He left the expedition the following day, claiming, "The land doesn't want company." His final note, written before returning east, simply read, "They are not lost. They are keeping watch." It was around this same period that a university historian revisited the San Elizario Salt War documents, hoping to trace the social impact of frontier violence. In his margin notes, he mentioned the Lafferty sisters as an unverified but persistent folklore presence, connected symbolically to the lawlessness of the 1870s. Even in academic circles, the story refused to vanish. What had started as a small case in a forgotten county had become a symbol of the frontier's unfinished business, a cautionary echo of justice denied and vengeance endured. By 1898, Sierra Verde was entirely gone. No buildings stood, no trail signs marked the roads. Yet riders claimed that on windless nights, the desert still carried a pulse. Some said it was just the earth cooling under the stars. Others, more quietly, swore it was the steady rhythm of two horses, never rushing, never resting, crossing the same endless miles they had claimed as their own. And so the mapmakers drew new lines, the world turned modern, but the flats kept their secret. The women who rode through Texas nights had left no graves, only the sound of their hooves fading into forever. By the turn of the century in 1900, the Texas frontier had become a memory retold in parlors and history books. Steam engines roared where horses once ran, and telegraph lines stitched the state together like nervous scars. Yet in the western deserts, where maps still carried blank spaces, the past never truly stayed gone. It lingered in dust, in rumor, and in the rhythmic heartbeat of unseen hooves. The story of the Lafferty sisters resurfaced once more through the writings of a journalist named Miriam Dunn, a correspondent for the Dallas Herald. She traveled through Hudspeth County to collect first-hand accounts of Texas legends before they were lost to time. Her articles, serialized under the heading Echoes of the Badlands, devoted an entire column to the sisters. In her introduction, she referred to them as the unburied daughters of the Salt War, tying their legend directly to the turmoil following the San Elizario Salt War 2 decades earlier. But unlike earlier retellings, Dunn's account bore the quiet precision of someone who had stood where the story happened. She wrote, "I rode to the basin at sunset. The air was hot, unmoving, the salt crust white as bone. The earth seemed to hum faintly underfoot, like distant thunder. I dismounted only once, and I swear the ground exhaled." Locals guided her to the last standing structure, a collapsed barn thought to have belonged to the Laffertys. Inside Dunn, by 1902, the legend of the Lafferty sisters had taken on a life far removed from the truth, if truth had ever been part of it. Ballads were sung in border saloons about the women who rode with no moonlight, and broadsheets sold embellished retellings that painted them as vigilantes, outlaws, even saints. But within the small communities west of the Pecos, the story was never sung. It was spoken softly, as if overheard by someone unseen. That year, a retired marshal named David Cormack returned to Hudspeth County to settle his affairs. He had served during the years following the San Elizario Salt War, overseeing scattered settlements like Sierra Verde. Cormack kept a habit of writing nightly reflections, and though most dealt with cattle disputes and family feuds, one entry stood out starkly: "Rode out to the basin, still as ever. I swear I saw two riders in the distance, side by side, heading toward the sun. Looked like smoke more than flesh. I blinked and they were gone." Cormack was a rational man. His notes show no sign of fanciful belief, no talk of spirits or omens. Yet his tone grew increasingly uncertain after that day. In later pages he mentioned finding a half-buried bit of iron, a stirrup etched faintly with the letters CL. He took it home, meaning to clean it, but that night his horse broke free of the corral and ran for miles. Cormack wrote, "The desert knows what's hers. I'll not bring back what it claimed. He left the stirrup buried by the roadside and never returned to retrieve it. A year later, he was found dead in his sleep, journal open to a blank page. His daughter donated the book to a local archive, where historians studying frontier folklore later noted the remarkable consistency between his entry and accounts recorded almost 30 years earlier. Different witnesses, same terrain, same two riders. By now the Lafferty sisters were less people and more presence. Cowhands refused to travel alone after dusk, and some caravans paid old guides to speak for them when crossing the flats, a ritual involving a quiet greeting to the air and a promise not to linger. Few could say why it helped, but those who performed it swore they never heard hooves behind them. Those who forgot often returned pale, trembling, muttering of wind that whispered their names. A local newspaper attempted one final investigation in 1904, hoping to dismiss the stories. Their reporter spent 3 days near the basin and returned shaken. His article was never published, but a typescript found among his papers carried only one paragraph. The nights are not empty here. The stars burn low as if afraid to look down, and somewhere out beyond sight, 2 riders move with the patience of the grave. After that, no more expeditions were attempted. Sierra Verde's story slipped back beneath the sand, where silence at last could keep its watch. By 1906, what was once the wild frontier had become a quiet stretch of modern ranchland. Telegraph lines hummed over the same earth that had once carried hoofbeats, and new settlers built small homesteads along the Pecos route without ever realizing they were living on the bones of stories. Only the oldest ranchers remembered the Lafferty name, and even they spoke it sparingly, as if saying it aloud might wake the dust. That spring, a new owner, Mr. Robert Tilden, purchased what remained of the Sierra Verde Basin. He intended to raise cattle and perhaps sell salt from the flats. Tilden was a practical man, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and he dismissed the local warnings as superstition. "Ghosts don't ride horses," he told the blacksmith in Fort Davis, but in his first season strange happenings began to wear down his certainty. His ranch hands refused to camp near the old creek. They said the ground there trembled after sundown, as though something beneath it stirred. Horses shied from the basin even in daylight, nostrils flared, eyes wide. One young worker quit after a single week, claiming to have seen 2 riders on the ridge at twilight, moving silently, the air behind them hazy with heat, though the evening was cool. Tilden went himself the next night to prove the boy wrong. He saw nothing. Yet when he returned to camp, his rifle was missing, taken clean from the wagon. He found it the next morning laid across a nearby boulder, stock facing east, as though deliberately placed. That incident was never explained. But in his letters to his sister, Tilden began to sound less skeptical. "There is a feeling here," he wrote, "a sort of watchfulness in the air. The nights breathe differently. It's as if someone is waiting for the land to forget them. And it refuses." A historian who reviewed these letters in later decades noted their eerie similarity to field reports written during the San Elizario Salt War, accounts describing invisible sentinels and the hush before gunfire. That never comes. Tilden himself may not have known that his ranch sat squarely upon the route once used by both insurgents and traders tied to that violent chapter. If the sisters had indeed lingered there, he had unknowingly disturbed sacred ground, the boundary between memory and consequence. In the fall of that same year, a storm swept through the basin. When it cleared, Tilden's barn was gone, lifted clean from its foundation and scattered across the flats. The man himself left soon after, abandoning his claim. Neighbors said he moved north, tired of being looked at by what he couldn't see. By 1907, the land returned to silence. Grass crept through the old fence lines, and the salt shimmered under the Texas sun like glass. But at night, when the wind rose low and steady, travelers still swore they heard the faint echo of hooves, 2 riders pacing side by side, heading nowhere the living could follow. By 1910, the Lafferty name had nearly vanished from every surviving record, its few traces lost in courthouse fires, collapsed archives, and the carelessness of time. Yet the story lived on, not in ink or documents, but in what people still refused to do. No one built near Verde Creek. No one camped beside the basin. And when night fell over that barren stretch of Texas, travelers rode faster, eyes forward, heads down. A schoolteacher from El Paso, Miss Clara Nunez, recorded one of the last first-hand accounts that would ever reach print. While traveling through the region to collect oral histories, she stayed a single night at a ranch house near the old Lafferty land. Her host, an elderly widow, told her a story that began like so many others. 2 sisters wronged, 2 riders unburied, 2 names spoken only when the wind was kind. But that night, Nunez claimed to have heard them for herself. It was a rhythm, faint but deliberate, hoofbeats in pairs. Not thunderous, not close, just steady, patient, circling the house until dawn. She included the account in her 1911 essay, Legends of the Western Frontier. Within it, she referenced the San Elizario Salt War once more, connecting the sisters' story to the unrest that birthed so much violence and silence in those years. Nunez wrote, "Every war leaves its own echoes. Some wear uniforms, others ride unseen." It was the final known mention of the Lafferty sisters in a printed work before the First World War drew attention elsewhere. Decades later, historians would look back at her essay and see in it not ghost story but metaphor, a lingering reflection of women erased from history, surviving only as rumor in men's retellings. Yet those who have walked the basin since tell a simpler truth: the land itself never forgot. Even now, they say, the salt crust shifts under the sun as if breathing, and the nights stay too quiet, the stars too distant. The ruins of Sierra Verde were finally excavated in 1915. Archaeologists found nothing of consequence,